There is a room in Turin, Italy, that most tourists never enter. It sits beneath the public galleries of the Museo Egizio, behind a climate-controlled door in a section of the building reserved for researchers with credentials and appointment letters. The air inside is dry. The temperature is held at a precise 14 degrees Celsius. And on a steel shelf, sealed inside an archival box catalogued as CGT 54003, sits a piece of papyrus that is older than the Roman Empire, older than the Greek city-states, older than almost everything we consider foundational to Western civilization. Most people walk right past it. The ones who do see it, the scholars, the Egyptologists, the visiting academics, tend to spend a few minutes with it, take their notes, and move on. It is, on the surface, a fragmented administrative document, a list, columns of names written in red and black ink, hieratic script, which is the cursive shorthand of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. Nothing about it looks dangerous. Nothing about it looks like it could rewrite history. But hidden inside it is something that shouldn't exist. When researchers ran a suite of advanced spectral imaging scans on these fragments between 2009 and 2022, they found something beneath the visible ink, a layer of text that had been deliberately washed away, not faded by time, not degraded by moisture or light, washed, scraped, erased with intention. And what that text contained, the names, the titles, the reign lengths recorded in years and months and days, does not match what we think we know about one of the most important periods in ancient Egyptian history. This is the story of what was written and what was unwritten, and why someone nearly 3,000 years ago made absolutely certain that future generations would never know the difference. If this kind of investigation is your thing, make sure you subscribe right now. We go deep into the archaeology, the science, and the stories that don't make it into the mainstream textbooks. The papyrus is known as the Turin King List. Catalog number: Papyrus Turin, CGT 50003. It was found in 1820, somewhere in the ruins near Luxor, the ancient city of Thebes, by an Italian traveler and diplomat named Bernardino Drovetti. He was working for the French colonial administration at the time, collecting antiquities on behalf of wealthy European buyers. When he found the papyrus, it was already fragmented. He packed it into a wooden box and shipped it north. By the time it arrived in Turin and was unpacked, the journey had shattered it further. Dozens of pieces, some no larger than a thumbnail. The box was opened, and the fragments were scattered across a table, and the scholars who assembled them did their best, but they were working without any guide, without any original photograph, without any record of the original layout. They made mistakes. We know they made mistakes because the text stops making sense in places, reign lengths that are impossible, names placed out of sequence, sections that simply end mid-sentence and are followed by something unrelated. For nearly a century and a half, Egyptologists assumed these were the errors of a careless ancient scribe, or the damage of time, or the inevitable chaos of a document assembled from broken pieces. For decades, scholars dismissed it as incomplete, as a curiosity, as a flawed administrative artifact. Then, modern science found something that changed everything. In 2009, a researcher at the Museo Egizio named Federico Poole, working alongside a team from the University of Turin, was conducting a routine review of the archival storage when he found a sealed tray that had been placed on a shelf and apparently not opened since at least the 1940s. Inside were fragments of papyrus. These were not cataloged alongside the main King List sequence. They had been separated at some point, perhaps during the original sorting process in the 19th century, and they had simply been stored, forgotten, left in a box in a temperature-controlled room for the better part of 100 years. When Poole identified them as sections of the Turin King List, matching the handwriting, the ink composition, the specific shade of red ochre used for royal names, it was immediately recognized as significant. These were missing pieces of one of the most important ancient documents in existence. Not a myth, not a metaphor, actual physical fragments that had been sitting in a storage tray while the academic world assumed they were gone forever. Here's where it gets strange. When those fragments were incorporated into the larger project to digitally reconstruct the King List using multispectral and hyperspectral imaging, the technology revealed something that a visual inspection alone could never have caught. Beneath the visible ink, in the infrared and near-infrared spectrum, in the ranges that the human eye cannot see, but that modern sensors can read with startling clarity, there were traces of an earlier layer of text, ghost text, the chemical signature of carbon-based ink that had been diluted, scraped, and written over. In paleography, this is called a palimpsest. It is what happens when ancient scribes erased old text to reuse the surface. But the Turin King List was not supposed to be a palimpsest. It was supposed to be an original document, a clean administrative record. And the section where the ghost text appeared was not a blank margin or an unused area. It was the section that records the rulers of Egypt's Second Intermediate Period, a stretch of time lasting roughly from 1650 BC to 1550 BC, during which Egypt was divided, conquered in part by foreign rulers called the Hyksos, and then reunified by a Theban dynasty, whose descendants would become the great warrior pharaohs of the New Kingdom. The rulers listed in that section are, according to official Egyptology, poorly known, mostly ephemeral, reigning for months rather than years. A confused period that the Egyptians themselves treated as an embarrassment, a gap, an interruption. But the ghost text told a different story. Let us be precise about what was recovered and what it implies, because the details matter here. The first clue emerged from the column recording reign lengths in the midsection of the King List. The visible text, the surface text that generations of scholars have studied, lists a series of rulers with short, fragmentary reigns, months, sometimes days. The standard interpretation has always been that this reflects genuine political chaos, a period of rapid succession, of petty kings ruling tiny territories, of an Egypt that was barely a functioning state. But the ghost text beneath showed something different. The erased entries in that same column contained reign lengths measured in years, substantial years. One entry, partially recoverable by the imaging team's enhancement algorithms, appeared to record a reign of 17 years. Another suggested somewhere between 12 and 22 years, the exact number obscured by the depth of erasure. These are not ephemeral rulers. These are kings who sat on a throne long enough to build things, long enough to leave records, long enough to matter. So why were they replaced with shorter, more chaotic versions of their own reigns? The mainstream answer is scribal error. A copyist working during the reign of Ramses II, which is when the Turin King List is believed to have been composed, roughly 1250 BC, may have simply made mistakes, may have confused sources, may have had access to incomplete records. But that explanation has a problem. Scribal errors in ancient Egypt tended to be corrections made in the margin, additions made between lines. A professional scribe working on an official administrative document, and the Turin King List was absolutely an official document, not casual writing, did not wash away an entire column of text and rewrite it with different numbers. That is not an error. That is a revision. And revisions are made for a reason. The second clue comes from the structure of the erased section itself. When the imaging team was able to partially reconstruct the layout of the ghost text, they noticed something that had no parallel in the visible, surface version of the document. The erased section appeared to contain a notation, a brief descriptive phrase that accompanied certain rulers' names. Phrases of this kind appear elsewhere in the King List for extraordinary figures, the way a modern document might include a title or a designation. Things like the one who united the two lands, or son of Ra, beloved of Amun. The notation in the erased section was different. The team's linguistic analysis suggested something closer to keeper of the outer records, or possibly guardian of the buried archive. The translation is contested. The phrase is partially intact, partially inferred, but both readings point toward the same concept: an administrative function, not a military title, not a religious designation, a reference to records, to archives, to documentation that was stored somewhere, possibly underground, possibly in a location that no longer exists, or has not yet been found. Not similar to other administrative titles, not inspired by them. The same structure used for official record-keeping functions, applied to rulers whose names were subsequently erased. For decades, scholars dismissed those rulers as symbolic placeholders, as fiction inserted into the list to fill gaps in institutional memory. Then, the ghost text suggested they had actual titles, actual administrative functions, actual years of reign that someone, at some point, decided should not be preserved. The third clue requires us to step outside the Turin Museum entirely and travel roughly 2,600 kilometers east to the Rijksmuseum van Oudenheden in Leiden, the Netherlands. Inside that museum, also behind glass, also in a conservation environment, sits another ancient Egyptian papyrus. This one is catalogued as Papyrus Leiden I-344. Most people who study ancient Egypt know it as the admonitions of Ipuwer, or simply the Ipuwer Papyrus. It was also found in the Luxor region, also in the early 19th century, also by European collectors operating in the ambiguous legal space of the antiquities trade. The Ipuwer Papyrus describes in vivid and desperate language a period of catastrophic collapse. Rivers turned to blood. The land turned upside down. The great are brought low and the poor elevated. Foreigners walking freely through the palace. No grain in storage. No one going to the temple. It reads like poetry. It reads like lament. For a long time, scholars treated it as literary invention, a morality tale dressed as historical memory. Here's where it gets strange. When researchers compared the administrative terminology used in the Ipuwer Papyrus against the partial ghost text recovered from the Turin King List, they found a linguistic overlap that should not exist if these documents were composed independently for different purposes at different times. Specific compound phrases, specific bureaucratic constructions. The kind of overlap that happens when two documents are drawing from the same source material, from the same archive, from whatever the keeper of the outer records was keeping. The Ipuwer Papyrus does not just describe chaos. It describes the collapse of a system, a filing system, an administrative infrastructure. It specifically laments that all the records have been taken away, that the chambers of records are opened to anyone who walks in, that whatever was stored in those chambers is now gone or exposed. And if that's true, it means our history is missing a chapter. Specifically, it means that at some point during or before the Second Intermediate Period, there was an administrative infrastructure in Egypt sophisticated enough to maintain records across multiple reigns, records that were housed somewhere specific, possibly underground, possibly in a location that both the King List and the Ipuwer Papyrus treat as central to the functioning of the state, and that, at the moment of collapse, those records either vanished, were deliberately destroyed, or were taken by someone who understood their value. This brings us to what modern archaeology has found, and what it has not been allowed to fully investigate. In 2019, a joint Egyptian-European archaeological team conducting ground-penetrating radar surveys in the necropolis zone south of Saqqara, the ancient burial complex southwest of Cairo, detected an anomaly at a depth of approximately 18 to 22 meters below the surface. The anomaly was large, roughly 40 meters in one direction and between 15 and 20 meters in the other, according to the survey data released in a preliminary report by the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities. It showed a density and regularity consistent with constructed chambers rather than natural geology. The radar signature suggested multiple rooms, possibly connected by corridors, at a depth that would have required significant engineering to excavate in any era. The report was filed, the coordinates were recorded, the excavation permit was applied for, and then the project went quiet. Not canceled, not officially concluded, quiet. The researchers involved stopped publishing updates. The Egyptian authority responsible for approving excavations in that zone did not issue a denial. They simply did not respond to the permit application within the standard window. When journalists and researchers affiliated with independent archaeological review organizations attempted to follow up, they were told the site was under administrative review pending further assessment. That was 2020. As of the most recent available documentation, no licensed excavation has taken place at those coordinates. Meanwhile, in April of 2026, archaeologists working in a different part of the Luxor region, on the West Bank near the Valley of the Queens, uncovered 8 papyrus scrolls inside a sealed, rock-cut funerary chamber. The scrolls were found alongside a group of coffins belonging to temple chanters, singers attached to the cult of Amun. The scrolls were intact. They bore their original clay seals, which had not been broken, 3,000 years old, untouched. They have not been read, not because the technology does not exist, not because the scholars are unavailable. The scrolls are in conservation. The unsealing process is ongoing. No transcripts, no translations, no preliminary descriptions of the content have been made public. Now, does this prove the most extreme version of the story? Probably not. The administrative silence around the Saqqara radar anomaly may be bureaucratic inertia rather than deliberate suppression. The sealed Luxor scrolls may contain nothing more than standard mortuary liturgy, the kinds of texts found in abundance throughout Egyptian burial sites. The ghost text in the Turin King List may reflect a complicated scribal revision process that does not imply intentional deception. These are real possibilities, and intellectual honesty requires we acknowledge them. But that doesn't make the discovery ordinary, because even the conservative reading of what the hyperspectral scans revealed presents a genuine historical problem. Someone, a scribe, an administrator, an institution, chose to revise the official record of Egyptian kingship during a specific period, chose to replace longer, more stable reign lengths with shorter, more chaotic ones, chose to remove administrative titles that implied the existence of an organized archive. This revision happened close enough to the original composition that the 2 layers of ink were applied to the same physical surface, which means the revision was not made centuries later by someone who had lost the original. It was made deliberately, near the time of original composition, by someone who had access to the document and the authority to alter it. That is not an error. That is a decision. And decisions of that kind, the kind that reach into official historical records and systematically remove inconvenient information, are made when something is at stake, when a lineage needs to be protected, when a precedent needs to be erased, when the existence of an organized, functioning state during a period that the new rulers want defined as chaotic would undermine the legitimacy of everything that came after. Think about what this means in practical terms. The rulers of Egypt's new kingdom, the pharaohs whose temples still stand, whose statues fill museums from Cairo to London to New York, justified their authority in part by positioning themselves as the restorers of order after a dark age. The Hyksos invasion and the Second Intermediate Period served a narrative function. It was the chaos from which the great warriors of the 18th and 19th dynasties emerged. It was the proof that only a unified, divinely appointed Egyptian monarch could keep the world from falling apart. If the Second Intermediate Period was not actually chaotic, if those ephemeral rulers had in fact been managing stable, multi-year reigns, if there was a functioning administrative infrastructure with its own archive, its own documentation system, its own institutional memory, then the Dark Age narrative collapses. And with it, part of the legitimizing mythology of every pharaoh who came afterward. It was sealed, it was mapped, and then it disappeared. There is one final detail that does not fit any of the standard explanations, and it is the detail that has stayed with me longest since I first encountered this research. Among the partially reconstructed ghost text sections from the Turin King List fragments, there is a notation in the lower margin of one fragment, a fragment that connects to the section listing the names and reigns of the disputed period, that the imaging team flagged as anomalous. It is not a king's name, it is not a reign length, it is a directional reference, east and south, a measurement expressed in a unit called an ITRG, which is an ancient Egyptian unit of distance, roughly equivalent to 10.5 kilometers. The number is partially legible. It reads as either 3 or 30 ITRU, depending on how the imaging enhancement resolves the faded section. 3 ITR would place the reference point approximately 30 kilometers from the site of the notation's likely origin, which would put it somewhere in the general region of the Fayum Oasis, one of the oldest inhabited areas of ancient Egypt, a location with known but incompletely excavated administrative infrastructure from precisely the period in question. 30 ITR would place it more than 300 kilometers south, near Luxor, near the Valley of the Kings, near the same general region where 8 sealed scrolls now sit in conservation, unread, behind locked doors, with their clay seals intact. They weren't guessing. They were recording. The question is what they were recording the location of. The question is whether what they were pointing to is still there. The question is whether the people who have the authority to look have any intention of letting us know what they find. The Turin King List is still in Turin. Papyrus Leiden I-300 and 44 is still in Leiden. The Saqqara radar coordinates are still in the preliminary survey report filed in 2019. The 8 sealed scrolls are still in conservation, somewhere in Luxor. And in a sealed tray on a climate-controlled shelf in a museum basement, there are almost certainly more fragments that have not yet been examined with the imaging equipment that can read what is hidden beneath the surface. Somewhere between those fragments, those coordinates, and those unopened seals, there is a chapter of human history that someone went to considerable trouble to erase. Not from the ground, not from the ruins, from the official record itself, from the document that future generations were supposed to trust. The ink is gone, but the impression remains. The technology exists to read it. The only thing that remains uncertain is whether anyone with the authority to act on what it says will ever choose to. If this investigation raised questions you can't stop thinking about, hit the like button and make sure you're subscribed. We cover discoveries like this every week. And if you want to go deeper on the pharaohs who were deliberately erased from Egyptian history, the kings whose statues were shattered, whose names were chiseled out of temple walls, whose tombs were systematically stripped, that video is on screen right now. The erasure didn't start with the Turin King List. It started much earlier, and the full story is far stranger than you've been told.